It's theAnalysis-news. I'm Sharmini Paris, coming to you from Toronto. Venezuela is now at the center of one of the most consequential political and economic crises in modern history. There are many issues colliding here that has serious implications for the country, the region, and geopolitical realignment, not to mention the climate crisis. As the former President Nicolas Maduro has been abducted and is being held in New York to face drug trafficking charges, Vice President Delcy Rodríguez has assumed the role of interim president, tasked with holding together a state under sanctions, external political pressure, and escalating demands from Washington to control its oil industry. All this is happening at a time when scientists warn the Earth is pushing well beyond its limits, when 7 of the 9 planetary boundaries that define a safe operating space for life have been breached, from climate change and biosphere collapse to ocean acidification and chemical pollution. We are in deep trouble. So, at a time when the world should be talking about winding down fossil fuels, the United States and Venezuela are negotiating how to ramp up extraction, exports, and profits from oil. The Trump administration has demanded broad access to Venezuela's energy sector, tied sanctions relief to crude exports, and announced plans to redirect Venezuela's oil from Russia, China, Iran, and Cuba to the United States. Now, supporters frame this as stabilization. Critics call it economic warfare, using sanctions, military threats, and political pressure to force compliance and secure control over oil. The question now facing Venezuelans and the rest of the world is pretty blunt. Is Delcy Rodríguez, the interim president of Venezuela, navigating an impossible situation to prevent economic collapse and to stabilize her country? Or is Venezuela's oil and its sovereignty being traded away under coercion to satisfy U.S. geopolitical goals and the powerful oil interests at stake? To weigh how Venezuela's interim president, Delcy Rodríguez, is equipped to deal with the crisis, we are joined by Gregory Wilpert, journalist, sociologist, and longtime analyst of Venezuelan politics and U.S.-Venezuela relations. He's the author of the book, Changing Venezuela by Taking Power, The History and Policies of the Chávez Government. He is co-founder of the website VenezuelaAnalysis.com and was director of Telesur English. Greg, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for inviting me.
Greg, let's start with Delcy Rodríguez, who has assumed the role of interim president under very extraordinary circumstances. How is her leadership being viewed inside Venezuela right now? Is she equipped to undertake this role? And how much leverage does Rodríguez actually have in these talks? How much is being dictated by Washington?
Yeah, I think she's facing a very delicate balancing act at the moment, because on the one hand, she needs to present one particular discourse towards her own population within Venezuela. And the other hand, she doesn't want to necessarily antagonize President Trump too much, because after all, he's constantly threatening with further military action or a blockade of Venezuelan oil shipments, which is putting tremendous pressure on her and the government and the people of Venezuela. So I think this is, it's a balancing act that I think she can actually manage, but she's clearly believes in, I think, also that what the United States did and what Trump did in terms of kidnapping President Maduro is completely illegitimate. And recently I just saw her speak at the memorial service for the people who died during the attack and the kidnapping of Maduro. And she was very clear that this was an unprecedented act and that the United States was acting in a very clearly imperialist, aggressive manner that is contrary to Venezuelan principles and Venezuela's desire to live in peace with the United States. So that's that's a discourse that she's going to have to maintain, and I think she really believes that too. Uh, but at the same time, she also wants to make sure that Trump doesn't further tighten the screws against Venezuela. And so when she's talking to Trump, let's say on the phone or whatever, I'm sure she's going to be, and this is according to Trump himself as well, she's going to be much more conciliatory and agreeable to anything that he says. But this, and we can probably get into this a little bit more, shows also a little bit the fact that she can do that shows a little bit that that the two different positions, that is vis-a-vis Venezuela and vis-a-vis Trump, are actually not that contrary. That is, what the things that Trump is demanding aren't things that are completely out of this world for Venezuela to concede, and so it's not. Even though rhetorically it sounds like very far apart, in actual practice, they're not that incompatible.
Greg, give us some examples of that. It's really important.
Well, the Trump administration is claiming that it's demanding Venezuela give access to for U.S. oil companies to produce oil in Venezuela. Now, this is not something that Venezuela has ever really denied. And sure, there was a nationalization and so on that happened, in the 1970s. But U.S. oil companies have been involved in oil production in Venezuela throughout the time for over 100 years in Venezuela and throughout the Chavez presidency. And the only reason they left was because of U.S. sanctions. It wasn't because of a choice on the part of the Venezuelan government. Now, there was, a switch in terms of how much U.S. oil companies were involved in joint ventures. They were required to have a minority stake that is slightly less than 50% in order to continue. And many oil companies, actually most oil companies, agreed to those new terms. The only one that didn't was ExxonMobil. So they were the only ones who left voluntarily because of the new kind of legal framework in which Venezuela was operating under Chavez. But all the others stayed. The only reason they ended up leaving was because of U.S. sanctions eventually. So this is not a far reach for Delcy Rodríguez to say, "Sure, you're welcome to come back." Of course, the nitty gritty details of the terms, how much, what percentage in taxes, what percentage of royalties, what percentage of ownership stakes, those need to be perhaps negotiated. But already under Maduro already said that he's willing to sweeten the deal tremendously compared to the Chavez years, just to get the investment to come back. So that's a very simple. There's other examples. I mean, which haven't really been much for negotiation, but they were part of Secretary of State Marco Rubio's list of demands, and Trump's demands too, I think, by extension, which was, to stop sending immigrants to the United States and things like that. Of course, Venezuela government never wanted to do that. That was also a result of sanctions. The other thing was perhaps to stop drug trafficking. Well, that's also another ridiculous claim, because that never was, Venezuela never was a big drug trafficker in the first place. So, this is also something that's not an issue for Venezuela. The Trump administration can claim an easy win there. Oh, we caught the major, not an easy win, but in the sense that they kidnapped Maduro. But now that they have him, they can say, okay, now the oil, I keep saying oil, but I mean the drug problem is solved, and that's not much that the government and Venezuela needs to do on that issue. So there's really a confluence on many issues. The only one where they're diametrically opposed is the issue about returning Maduro, which is of course something that Delcy Rodríguez continues to insist on, and of course Trump will not concede that one issue. I can't imagine that he would.
Now, many people are asking this question. Has Delcy Rodríguez effectively sold out Venezuela's oil and, by extension, the Venezuelan people to Trump?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, the claim that Trump is controlling Venezuela is really getting more and more extreme. I mean, first he said, that the U.S. was going to run Venezuela.
So we're going to stay until such time as we're going to run it, essentially, until such time as a proper transition can take place.
of course, that's not really true. And then just now, I think the other day, Trump posted a picture of himself with the caption that said "President of Venezuela." And I mean, he's in a way is just making things more difficult for himself, I think, by making these kinds of claims, because it's just going to sour his relationship with not only with Delcy Rodríguez, but also his relationship with the rest of Latin America. To make these kind of basically pretending to be the king, essentially, of all of Latin America eventually. But in terms of the concrete deals, I think what's in the talks, it seems, is that the U.S. government will sell the Venezuelan oil that's been stored, and so we're talking about this $30 to $50 billion deal of the stored oil so far, and that would go onto the international markets, and the United States would control the funds from that. Now, in some sense, and the details of that deal haven't been released really, so I don't know exactly how it works. But from what I've heard, is that it's going to be similar to the deal that Chevron currently has with Venezuela, which is that also where Venezuela gets to basically keep some of the oil in order to sell on its own. Now, I don't know exactly how this is going to work in terms of, because now they're claiming that they're going to sell all of it. But anyway, there's a percentage of it that's supposed to be under the control of the Venezuelan government. Now, that's not completely clear exactly how that's going to be. But anyway, the idea is to imitate or to copy more or less that Chevron deal in some sense, where it's through an indirect route that Venezuela will get some of that. Exactly how much and how, it's hard to say. We really don't know.
Okay, now, Greg, this is very interesting given, what Trump is also doing in terms of threatening Colombia, where you've also lived, and President Petros in particular, and also in terms of, recently threw out allegations about, controlling the drug trafficking from Mexico as well. How is this being received in Latin America? And is there any effort to sort of stand up to Trump as a collective here?
Well, yeah, I mean, for one thing, the governments of Gustavo Petro and Claudia Sheinbaum of Mexico and Petro of Colombia, they have been, of course, very, very forceful in in rejecting any of these things that Trump has been suggesting. And but at the same time, Petro has been reaching out to Trump as well, trying to convince him to kind of soft pedal some of his rhetoric, because it's been extremely inflammatory in the sense that I think they had talked recently, and since then it's calmed down a little bit, the rhetoric on Trump's side. But then he continued with Mexico, and then of course Claudia Sheinbaum tries to intervene and try to calm things down as well. Now, obviously, the countries that are Latin America is very divided at the moment between left and center-left governments and right and center-right governments, and they tend to be more polarized in that sense. That is, more further to the left and right rather than center. And so you see a very clear division that is, with the right-wing governments generally supporting Trump and the left-wing governments forcefully rejecting everything that Trump is doing, and the left-wing governments, most importantly, are of course Brazil also, and Colombia and Mexico. Those are the largest and most populous ones. The government of Chile is about to change hands, and so not much has been happening. And then there's, of course, Argentina, which is another far-right government. So in a way, because of this division, Latin America is extremely immobilized. That is, UNASUR, which Chavez had originally designed together with Lula and former president of Ecuador, Rafael Correa, has not been able to come together at all because of this extreme division that previously was never that extreme, that is during the Chavez years. So unfortunately, we're not going to see much of a united front for all of Latin America, but just each of these sides, each of these camps are uniting. And what are they going to do concretely? It's difficult to say. I mean, there's not too much they can do other than try to make sure that that they stand together in solidarity with each other, essentially. Of course, at the same time, I think Trump needs to be very careful that the populations of Latin America, whether they are more sympathetic to right-wing governments or to the left, doesn't really matter. They're not going to like these overtures, no matter where they stand politically. So that's going to be, I think, going forward, a real problem for Trump. I mean, he's going to alienate all of Latin America, I think, more than ever. And I think there's little doubt about that. I mean, you already see that happening.
And Greg, the new oil deal that Trump is seeking, he's demanding that Venezuela redirect its crude away from China, Russia, Iran, even Cuba, towards the United States. What does this tell us about the real strategic goal here in terms of energy supply and geopolitical dominance and reasserting U.S. control in the hemisphere?
It's hard to say because on the one hand, this is pure stupidity in terms of what Trump is trying to do is all things that the U.S. could have avoided all along. That is, if it weren't for the sanctions, the United States would still be Venezuela's main oil recipient. So these are things that, again, it's just because of the sanctions that Venezuela turned towards China and also help from Russia and Iran in terms of oil production. None of that would have happened if it hadn't been for the U.S. government's opposition, that is particularly starting since 2015 under Obama. Venezuela would still be supplying the United States. And as a matter of fact, there are a number of refineries in the United States that were specifically built for handling Venezuela's heavy crude, and were receiving all of that oil. And they've been retooled to some extent, I believe, to receive more Canadian oil, perhaps. So now that's probably going to shift back to Venezuelan oil. So again, this is part. It's a really kind of crazy, geostrategic consideration that is where they're contradicting each other. There's on the one hand try to change the Venezuelan government by imposing sanctions, which forces Venezuela to deal with and invite China and Iran and Russia into Latin America. And now they're reversing that. This is all just a result of U.S. foreign policy decisions that really does not have that much to do with what Venezuela actually wants.
Now, looking ahead, is there a realistic path for Venezuela to regain control over its oil industry and of course, its political future? Or has this crisis fundamentally reshaped how Venezuela positions itself in terms of global, regional, and even national sovereignty?
The big question again comes as to how much participation will Venezuela allow, and how much oil revenues will go to these transnational companies. Now, because Venezuela's oil industry has been suffering so much from a lack of investment due to U.S. sanctions, I think that cannot be repeated often enough, because the large international media keep on claiming that it was mismanagement on the part of the Venezuelan government. That might be true to some factor or to some extent, but the vast majority, I estimate something like 80% of the decline, can be attributed to the sanctions, and which have caused a lack of investment and a lack of maintenance and so on. And now, of course, they're going to try to attract these investments by giving these companies more favorable terms, which means potentially giving them a much higher participation in the joint ventures, and giving them lower taxes and lower royalty requirements for the oil production. But this, again, we don't know exactly how this is going to turn out, because the talk so far has only been about the United States actually controlling the revenues to a large extent, and so it's all kind of still up in the air. But I mean, I think Trump is so eager to provide favorable conditions for transnational oil companies to move into Venezuela, such as we could see with the recent meeting that he had with oil executives, in order to encourage them to invest in Venezuela, he's going to have to concede on some of the U.S. control too, because it's the oil companies aren't necessarily going to want the U.S. government to be controlling their involvement in Venezuela, so it's all of this remains to be seen.
Greg, there's been some great resistance on the part of the oil companies in terms of returning to Venezuela. At least that's what we have been hearing in the media in response to the meetings that Trump held with the oil sector executives. Now, is there any, I guess, legitimate concern in terms of investing in Venezuela in that way? And do you think that the oil companies will be lining up to return to Venezuela or not?
Well, the big problem that the oil companies are having is, first of all, that the price of oil is fairly low, and Venezuelan oil is very expensive to produce because it is heavy and extra heavy crude mostly. The light crude has been mostly tapped in Venezuela and is continuously declining and not lack of investment simply because those light crude oil fields are running out. So that means the ones that are remaining are the ones that need to be very heavily processed and refined in order even to extract them from the ground and then to refine them for other uses. It's very expensive, and with oil prices being as low as they are right now, it's not that profitable to even do it. Not to mention the fact that in order to get those production facilities really going at maximum capacity, it's going to involve tens of billions of dollars and many years. And given that the political situation in Venezuela is still, you could say, kind of unstable. I mean, I think the government is firmly in place still, but with the constant threats coming from the Trump administration and the constant talk of possibly trying to have a change of regime change, essentially, no oil companies going to want to invest in those kind of conditions. So there's the combination of political instability and low oil prices. And I think one of the oil companies, ExxonMobil, said as much, and Trump immediately said, "Oh, we're going to ban you anyway," or something like that. We're not going to even let you go into Venezuela, which again seems kind of crazy. They're just saying that, well, it's not really profitable for us. ExxonMobil, I should mention, though, has always been the most vociferous, most antagonistic partner for Venezuela, because they were the only ones to actually sue the Venezuelan government when Chavez had introduced the change of the joint ventures. They eventually lost in court and only got what Chavez was originally going to offer them, but they were demanding something like 10 times as much, and were hoping to get that through international arbitration. So now they're taking a similar position, that is this hardline position that we need to have everything perfect in order to the way we want it in order to invest in Venezuela. But the other oil companies, they seem to be more willing, but it's really doubtful as to how many of them will actually stick their neck out, at least in the short term. In the long term, yeah, sure, they're probably interested, but I think it's going to take higher oil prices for it to be truly attractive.
And finally, Greg, how are the Venezuelans responding to the current crises, and particularly in terms of Delcy Rodríguez's leadership? Now, let me remind you, as vice president, that she also had the portfolio of managing PDVSA, and she has been working with the oil sector for quite a long time. Is there confidence in her leadership, and how are the local population responding to what they might seem as a threat from the United States and taking over of their oil industry?
I think Delcy Rodríguez, to some extent, managed to prove herself not only within the Maduro government, but also with regard to the rest of the population, when she was not only PDVSA's oil minister, but also head of the economics ministry. And so she had a very, very powerful and very important role. And Venezuela, despite the sanctions, managed to increase its GDP quite significantly in the past year or two. And so that's going to, and of course, it was coming from a very low level because in 2020, after the whole Guaido kind of coup attempt and all that, and the massive sanctions and oil production plummeting to less than 300 barrels per day. Actually, even I think it was even significantly below that at one point because the U.S. oil market was completely shut down. Um, it Since then, because it was so low, of course, it wasn't such a huge feat to bring it back to normal or to a higher level. But it still was an important achievement. And it was also, I think, thanks to her management that hyperinflation was brought under control, which happened also in that time period. That is right during the combination of the pandemic and the Guaido coup attempt and the U.S. sanctions, and so I think that's gained her a significant amount of respect. It's one of the reasons I think that Maduro placed her as vice president, and also I think that's earned her some respect within the Venezuelan population. I mean, it's very difficult to say because we don't really have any polls at the moment, but the only thing we have to compare her performance to is that of the opposition, and the opposition, particularly as led by Maria Corina Machado, is completely on the ground. I mean, Trump was actually correct, when he said that she doesn't have much legitimacy or respect in the country right now. That's true, absolutely true. The reason, of course, that she doesn't is because she's been advocating for U.S. intervention, military intervention in Venezuela. Nobody wants that. So, of course, it's kind of Trump's fault that she has garnered so little respect because he's been pushing that military intervention and she's been totally on his side. But so, in other words, at least in terms of what the alternatives are in Venezuela, Delcy Rodríguez is positioned pretty favorably. Now, that's not to say that people are necessarily think that she's a savior or anything like that. I don't think so, because Venezuelans have been suffering for a long time, and as a result, most of the country has actually become largely depoliticized, which is a real shame when you think of the Chavez years when the whole country was very politicized. It was one of the most politicized populations I've ever seen in all my traveling around the world. And whereas now people are just, thinking about how they're going to get ahead in terms of making a living, and again because of the sanctions. But as a result, politics is not necessarily on the top of their minds. Now, there's some exceptions to that, but they're not in the majority.
And Greg, according to the Venezuelan constitution, when this kind of a turnover or interim presidency is, in this case, forced upon Venezuela, there is a requirement to have an election within 90 days. What is the status of that conversation?
Yeah, I don't think there has been much of a conversation on that topic, and part of the problem has to do a little bit with the term, the way it is phrased. Now, I haven't looked at the Constitution recently, but if I remember correctly, the condition under which a new election has to be called, actually, I think it's even within 30 days, is when there's an absolute disappearance. I mean, I don't know how you would translate it, but they talk about falta absoluta, that is a complete lack of a president. Then there has to be an election in 30 days. And that was the case when Chavez died because he's not coming back because he died. So there was an election within 30 days. But this is slightly different because Maduro was kidnapped. So they could say, well, we're hoping he's going to come back very soon. And so therefore, we're just going to wait until he comes back. And in the meantime, that's why Delcy Rodríguez is an interim president until Maduro's return. So it's not an absolute disappearance of the president. It's just a temporary one. And so I'm not sure if that clause for calling new elections actually applies in this particular case. And I'm sure sooner or later, probably the Supreme Court of Venezuela will have to rule on this. But I mean, I don't think he's going to come back anytime soon. But clearly, that's the demand of the Venezuelan government at the moment.
Greg, I hope you can join us again quite soon as this crisis is evolving, and we look forward to having you back.
My pleasure. Thank you.
And thank you for joining us on theAnalysis.news.